Who here has seen the movie Chariots of Fire? So many of you might have. It's a 1981 historical British drama that actually won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Movie of the Year. And it's the story mostly about 2 British athletes who competed in the 1924 Paris Olympics. And one of the subplots, one of those stories, is about Eric Liddell, I believe is how he pronounced his name, son of Scottish missionaries, later himself would become a missionary to China. And an interesting subplot about him, a true story, is what happened was that Eric Liddell, he decided not to run in the 100-meter race, even though he was favored in that race. And he decided not to run in it because the heats for that race happened on the Sunday. And despite all the pressure he felt by king and country, by the British Olympic Committee, despite all that pressure to run in the 100-meter race, Liddell believed at heart to his faith was keeping the Sabbath holy, and he refused to run. Now, a compromise of sorts was reached, and he ran actually in the 400 meters race that he actually won a gold medal in. And I have always been struck when watching that movie and hearing that story by that kind of faith commitment of Eric Liddell to keep the Sabbath and the integrity of his faith commitment that would actually likely cost him a shot at a lifelong dream of competing in the Olympics. Now, I'll be honest, it was hard for me to relate to that choice. His example seems an artifact of a spiritual practice that actually, if we think about it, doesn't have much sway these days in today's world, except among many Orthodox Jewish communities. So I always thought of an artifact of the past. That is, until I read an article in ESPN recently about a young man, a 16-year-old kid from Maryland, Oliver Ferber, who ran cross country and who made the decision, this is a true story, not to run in the state cross-country track meet because the meet was on Saturday morning. Now, Oliver comes from a Jewish family whose religious observance, they would freely admit, was more cultural than ritualized. But during the early days of the pandemic, he found himself more and more gravitating toward his spiritual practices and faith, toward his Judaism, including a more strict approach to the holiness of Sabbath. So in 2021, his team was favored to actually win the state championship, and he was an integral part of that team. So his decision not to run had consequences. Resentment and anger from his teammates, from his coach who tried to convince him if he didn't run, they would lose, to even his mother who said, "Can't you really rethink this?" But he made the spiritual, religious choice to not run. So as he watched on his sidelines, his team actually pulled an upset and won the state meet. But that wasn't the end of the story. The next year, he petitioned the state to have the race run on another day. And it was successful. They ran on a Sunday. You know, Sabbath actually runs from evening of Friday evening till the fall of sunset on Friday evening till the evening of Saturday for Jewish faiths. That's when it runs. So in November of 2022, just last fall, he ran and they won the state championship again. And when he was asked, as he was celebrating what that day meant to him, the reporter said he kind of took a deep breath and paused 15, 20 seconds. And he smiled and he simply said, "It means I'm independent and I choose my own path." Oliver is a witness to me. Now, if I'm honest, keeping the Sabbath seems an odd religious and spiritual practice if you actually think about it. The choice to refrain from activity rather than engage in a specific activity seems a strange tradition. I understand maybe, what you put in your mouth, those practices that define us, but to actually be the defining feature of a religious community, such as the Judaic community throughout its history, its most defining feature, vital to their identity and who they are, is to keep the Sabbath. So important and so vital it is at the heart of the Ten Commandments. Commands God's children to rest rather than work. So in other words, you are not my people when you say the right prayers. You're not necessarily my children when you do the right actions. You are my people when you take a day off, right? Now, we often associate the reason for keeping the Sabbath is the story of creation, right? Where God worked those 6 days, as the story goes, and God rested on the seventh. But the commandment, as we read in Deuteronomy, and Kim, go ahead and pull that up and we'll look at this again. But the commandment to keep the Sabbath, we read this morning, is instead understood in other ways. He says, go to the next verse. Let's pull up, go back. Oh, keep going. Yes, go to the next verse. I'll keep trying to find it. Go to the next verse. Next verse. Remember, he says. This is why they're supposed to observe it. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The choice to refrain from activity is rooted in, not on a day of rest that God rested on the seventh day, but a reminder that they were enslaved and that they continually had no work and they had no choice but to work. So the way in which they remember their enslavement is to keep the Sabbath. You were slaves. You lived in the burden of unending work, but now you are free. You can choose a different path. So in a way, God has taken the people out of slavery, and now God is trying to take the slavery out of the people. Keeping Sabbath is an act of liberation. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, famous Old Testament scholar, wrote a book titled Sabbath as Resistance, Saying No to the Culture of Now. And he writes, I quote, "The Sabbath is a call to resist the dehumanizing God of perpetual frenzy and activity, to resist that dehumanizing God, to actively trust in God rather than the unceasing work of our hands and the limits of our credit cards to provide our needs." It's resistance, he says, because it's a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. It's a resistance, he says, to a culture of anxiety and coercion. that some might say we are enslaved to. Kara Root, a pastor in Minneapolis, Minnesota, writes a commentary on the Sabbath, and she writes that while we seek meaning from our lives, forces around us seek to shape how we find that meaning. And she defines how that culture shapes it. 24/7 connectivity in our pocket, right, ensures we're saturated with messages that strip us of our freedom, of our humanity, sucks us into a relentless comparison and division, ranking and judging, striving and measuring. I know she's really messing in when she's messing with my phone. I know that. With social media, texting, email, and phones ever at the ready, we're justified in acting as if the world can't run without us. Right? She quoted a statistic: the average American checks their phones 80 times a day while on vacation. Sabbath as liberation is a profound spiritual practice. We're regularly called to step out of the mindset and activity of the world around us, to resist, to be liberated from this measuring and comparing and competing and striving and producing and consuming. It is a commandment telling us we have to regularly stop doing and practice being. It is a reminder that our worth to God is not what we produce, but in God's love for our very being. Now, I must confess, sometimes as we as disciples and we as a church, we need this liberation as much as anyone. There are times I think I as a disciple or we as a church operate on a premise that Jesus is coming, so look busy, right? We get sucked into that same pattern, old pattern of competing and striving and measuring. But it's our faith. Church and discipleship becomes one more thing to feel like we got to check off our list, one more thing we have to accomplish, one more thing, let's admit it, to feel guilty about. Now put up the verses from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Jesus, one of the central conflicts Jesus had all through the Gospels, and one of the ways he found himself in profound conflict with the religious leaders of his time was how they were turning keeping the Sabbath into a maze of rules and regulations and talking about how you're not measuring up. He saw that as all wrong. One of his famous lines was that Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for Sabbath. And so he says these words when he's challenging these religious leaders who are trying to make people feel guilty about their failure of doing nothing. And he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me," he says, "learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So, it's a question we should ask ourselves over and over. At the heart of following Jesus is just not one more thing to do, but instead a letting go, a liberation from the heavy burdens we carry around. Keeping Sabbath is a way of being in the world profoundly free of that which would enslave us. So don't think keeping Sabbath is about following rules, because it's not. It's about reflecting on the ways we find rest, being amidst the busyness of all of our lives, the busyness of this very wrought world. Maybe it might be keeping Sabbath for some of us, turning off our phones. God, that makes me shudder. Maybe it's choosing one night a week where we refrain from activities and just be together as a family with friends and fellowship. Maybe it's a place of sanctuary where people can come not to find guilt, but to find rest. So one more thing. Keeping Sabbath is an act of justice. I don't know if you noticed when in that Deuteronomy text that God commands not only the Jews to keep Sabbath, but also commands that all should find rest, from the donkey to the other animals to all of creation, to even those who are enslaved. That this rest is commanded not only for those who follow Jesus, but for all creation. And it might be a reminder to us as we live in a world in which we struggle with the environment and the challenges of environment, that the commandment to keep Sabbath is a commandment to allow creation to rest, right? To recuperate and recover. Not just simply to see creation as something we continually pull from, but creation itself is called to rest. And I am reminded that one of the most profound things about that we probably don't realize about the poor and those who are disadvantaged is how much, I know the popular myth is they don't work, but the reality is poverty, you are overwhelmed with work. What we would find normal and easy, paying for our utility bill, being able to rely on a paycheck that's coming, not having to spend time and energy worrying about whether we're going to put food on the table for our folks or have to go down to the food bank and find food for our kids. It's unimaginable how much work those who are in poverty have to do just to survive. And there is something profound about the commandment to keep the Sabbath, that it's not only for our well-being and our deep spirituality, but it is also our call to creation in the world around us, to keep it holy, so that people are not measured by the bottom line of what's in their bank, or people are not measured by their Facebook posts. People are not measured by those things we hold so much in store. But they are measured by God's profound, abundant love. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.